you start?
Sure.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming and finding us down here lower third of Wasser State. My name is Susan Hackley. I'm the Managing Director of the Program on Negotiation. It's a great pleasure to see you, many practitioners, also dispute resolution, and students. It's just great. We have a sign-up sheet at the end of most rows, and if you want to hear about our events, please just give us your contact information. We have 2 amazing film events next week. Bridge of Spies with some very interesting speakers, and the new Abigail Breslin film, Armor of Light, about evangelicals in the United States starting to think about working on gun control issues because they care about life. Very interesting films. So today, I just want to very briefly introduce our speakers and get started because they have a lot to say and they also want to be very interactive. Gina Barbieri is a South African human rights lawyer. She currently lives and works in Washington, D.C., and she'll be talking about her work. She's the author of 2 books on labor dispute issues, editor of publications, co-founder of the African Institute for Mediation, and many other things. Really a wonderful person in the field. And David Hoffman, well known to many of us, a lecturer here at Harvard Law School, a renowned mediator, arbitrator, and attorney at Boston Law Collaborative, which he founded and which has received many awards, including the American Bar Association's annual Lawyer as Problem Solver Award. He's published 3 books on dispute resolution. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, where he was an editor on the Harvard Law Review. So welcome to you both. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I first say a minute? So I had the great good fortune of assisting with Gina's presentation at the conference of the International Academy of Mediators back in when was it, fall?
September,
yeah. And we wanted to have Gina come and tell the Academy about CAO because it offered so many learning points. Learning points about how to do conflict assessment in large, complex, multi-party cases, how to manage conflict in a situation where the mediators and the parties with whom the mediators are working may have similar backgrounds, may have different backgrounds, and where you're dealing with a very powerful entity, a national government, and people who are disenfranchised and coming from a place where they lack that kind of power, and many other challenges. The case study that Gina presented, which she's going to be presenting here today, strikes me as one that we can all learn from, no matter what kinds of dispute resolution work we do. And so my role here is really just going to be to help facilitate the conversation that will occur after Gina does her presentation, and maybe pose a question or 2 along the way, and to try to make this as much a conversation as possible. Does that sound about right?
Absolutely. Great. Thanks,
okay.
David. Wonderful.
So, and thank you all for being here. This is really absolutely wonderful. Gina.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, David. Thanks to the PON. Thanks to all of you for coming. Kind of having a moment of imposter syndrome sitting next to David Hoffman with all of the credentials that he carries. Wonderful to have him here. Thank you for being part of this again. I'm going to do a little bit of talking up front, but we really do want to keep this informal and provide enough time for discussion and questions. But the context is a fairly tricky one to punch through very quickly, so just bear with me. The last time we did this, David said, pictures, pictures, show more pictures. So I'm going to do that and hopefully keep the wordage and the verbiage a bit less. So what is the CAO? Just to contextualize the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, I'm sure for most of you this is the first time you've heard of us. We're one of many accountability mechanisms set up to hold international financial institutions accountable for their lending, for their investments. And we are particularly concerned about the environmental and social impacts of IFI-funded projects. So the dispute resolution work that I'm managing is very much in that context of private sector development, receiving funding from international financial institutions, and the impact those projects are having on local communities. And our goal is really to bring remedy to bear for those communities impacted by IFC MIGA-funded projects. Our office doesn't... Of course you can.
IFI, are you assuming just World Bank and IMF, or is that banking institutions as well?
It's many of the big multilaterals now actually have IAMs. I've got to be careful of the acronyms. Independent accountability mechanisms. The equator banks don't yet. I think they're following suit, but it is most of the multilaterals have these mechanisms now. So no, it's not just the World Bank or IMF. In fact, I don't know if the IMF has one, to be honest. I think they've got an internal ombudsman. I don't think they have an externally facing mechanism. And in essence, that's what we are. We have three functions: dispute resolution, compliance, and advisory. Compliance really looks at whether the institution complied with its environmental and social performance standards. Advisory is meant to advise and help the institution change and improve. Dispute resolution is about remedy for communities on the ground. So that is in total what the office does. We've had 153 cases in 46 different countries since inception in 2000. Currently, we have 21 cases in 12 countries across the globe in dispute resolution. So our team is currently managing 21 cases across the globe.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So if 21 cases, I don't know, some of you might think that sounds like a lot. Some of you might think it sounds like very few. But when you see the scope of this one case, I think you'll have an appreciation of what having 21 cases going simultaneously really means.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's a valid point, David. And that gives you a sense of the issues that we're dealing with. So as I said, mainly social and environmental impacts in all of the big footprint sectors, so agriculture, mining, extractives, and so on. So what we're going to do to try and give you a taste of the work and the use of mediation in public, in private sector community development projects at an international level is to deep dive into a case that we've recently concluded in Uganda. You've got some case studies on the same case to take with you if you're interested. And as David said, this is not unique to this case. These are issues that we're seeing, I can almost say, in the 21 cases that we're dealing with, and maybe not all on such a grand scale as this, but very similar issues and very, very complicated. So what happened in the Uganda case? In December 2011, we received a complaint from two communities who were evicted by the Ugandan government to make way for forestry plantations at the hand of an IFC-funded client, private sector client, the New Forest Company. At the time we received those complaints, Oxfam, who was supporting the community to bring us these complaints, had launched what they called the Global Land Grab campaign against IFI-funded projects that were forcing communities off the land. So to try and build up the story and then unpack it in terms of how we dealt with it through dispute resolution, I'm just going to give you some layering of the complexity of this complaint. So those are the two communities residing in the Mubende and Chiboga districts in Uganda. The government had proclaimed that the land that they were residing on was in essence central forestry reserve, and they were therefore entitled to evict any what they called encroachers on the land, people who were living on the land allegedly unlawfully. The government then, over the same swath of land, grants a license to the New Forest Company to come in and start planting pine and eucalyptus trees. The National Forestry Authority then goes ahead and evicts. Oxfam claims over 22,000 Ugandans who were living on the land. The government says that it wasn't nearly as many as 22,000, and in any event, even if it were, they shouldn't have been there anyway, so they needed to be removed. The affected communities brought a claim to the CAO, and they also went to the courts, but they essentially were alleging gross human rights violations. They claimed that there had been deaths at the hands of the government. They also claimed that the New Forest Company actually was involved in these evictions. And so tensions started mounting between those groups, and the government then decides that of the evicted families, 33 were entitled to compensation for the land. So now we have intra-community conflict also building up. We've got conflict between the government and the community members that were evicted and the company.
Is the company a Ugandan company?
No, it's not. It's British, primarily British-owned company. Yeah, receiving international financial assistance, not only from the IFC, from other multilaterals.
Relating to that.
Absolutely, yeah. With their head office based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Just out of curiosity.
Beg your pardon?
How big were the loans?
All of that, no, it wasn't millions, and in fact the IFC, the percentage shareholding was around 7%, so it wasn't, and it was through, the further complication was that was through an agribusiness fund in Johannesburg. It wasn't direct project lending to the New Forest Company. So the level of due diligence in terms of the performance standards, the IFC argues, is less than what was required if it were direct project financing. So Oxfam continues with its global land campaign, and as a result of that, the government decides that it might well evict Oxfam from Uganda because of all the noise that's being created. The community also goes to court to try and sue the government. They don't take any action against the company. They decide that they might have a fairer chance if they go to court to sue the government. By the time we got involved in the complaint, the government was really making some serious threats against the communities who had gone to court and had brought us the complaint. Furthermore, the government says to the New Forest Company, who at this stage we're saying, what are we going to do about this? We have fires, we have arson, we believe the communities living on our boundaries are never going to let us operate. We've got to develop some kind of relationship with them. Can we not talk to them about compensation? And the government said, if you compensate anybody for eviction, we will revoke your license to operate. So no, your hands are tied. So really, where does one begin in a situation of this complexity? And when I joined the CAO 4 years ago, this complaint was handed to me. And in essence, I was told, good luck with this. Lots of complexity in previous cases. This is not atypical, as I was saying. I think the difficulty here was at the time we received this complaint, this was hitting the international news. So the New York Times had a story about IFC's financing of the New Forest Company. The Guardian was all over the story. Oxfam were pushing their global land campaign. The government was threatening to evict Oxfam. And we were then asked by the community, can you come in and help us talk to the company? We need to find resolution. So that just sets the stage of what we then did. And I'm going to take you now through how we approached using dispute resolution in this context. Are there any questions about this?
So let me just make one observation. As a room full of dispute resolvers hears this frame for what, Gina, you were about to embark on with your team, I'll bet many of you are thinking, there must be some opportunities here to make people better off. There are people in need of a place to live. There's hopefully wealth to be created by exploitation and development, hopefully responsible development of resources. And so it seems like there's a lot to work with, and yet you're dealing with some big, formidable institutions and 22,000 people.
Absolutely.
So we're eager to hear how this worked out.
So lots of challenges, and you touched on a lot of those when we started, and we'll conclude with some challenges and ongoing issues that we're grappling with. Just to show you what we typically do in a dispute resolution process. I know when you use the terms mediation, conciliation, dispute resolution in different jurisdictions, there's so many different meanings, but often we're doing very similar things, whether it's court-referred mediation, Polly and I were talking about that earlier, or it's mediation in this context. So this just maps for you a process diagram of what we typically would do. And the first stage for us is the assessment, which is where we go in to analyze the conflict, to analyze the stakeholders, to do some stakeholder mapping, to determine what is it, what are the issues that are being raised in this complaint, and what does the community want us to do about those issues. So I'm going to use some pictures just to talk you through the use of this process in that context. So the assessment of this complaint. When we received it, it was eligible, it met our eligibility criteria. We then appointed 2 local mediators, well, one was Ugandan, one was Kenyan, to come in and help us with the assessment of this complaint. And the assessment really was to go and meet with the community. Easier said than done, right? These are evicted community members who by then had dispersed. So this is now 3 months after we received the complaint. We're in the field meeting with community members. So we've got to overcome obstacles of capacity, overcome obstacles of informed consent. This has to be about choice. Our dispute resolution option is voluntary. So how do you go to a community and try and explain the CAO in the context of the IFI arena? Oh, and by the way, do you want to engage with the company, and what is that going to look like? So really the assessment of the complaint for us took a good couple of months to get right. And we started by calling as many community members as we could to public meetings, where we were given an opportunity to explain who we were, to deal with expectations, because that's the other challenge we face. Challenge we continually face is you're from the bank, so you're here to compensate us. And so we have to start off the conversation by saying, like, these are all the things we're not here to do, but this is what we can offer you. So the assessment phase really is critical. And I didn't, in my prior practice as a mediator, I hadn't given much thought to how one goes in and does these assessments. And you learn really quickly. If you bypass this step, I don't think you get the scaffolding in place to then build these processes around them in a sustainable way.
Can you say a word about how you identified the 2 mediators, one from Kenya, one from Uganda?
Yeah. So we do, and when I joined the CAO, we had pretty much a golden Rolodex system. So who have you used before? Who seems to have the credentials? It wasn't a very open network of mediators, if you like. And so we just started calling our contacts. We had a set of criteria that we were using to appoint mediators. We interviewed a bunch of Ugandan mediators who had done this work before. And then we had already, when I joined the CAO, we were already using the Kenyan mediator on 2 other complaints in Uganda around the Bujagali Dam. So it was a natural fit for us to bring her in. The mediation team changed. By the time we moved from assessment into dispute resolution, we realized that in fact we needed to bring in a mediator that had way more experience in this community company conflict resolution arena, as well as some creative thinking around development projects. And how do you galvanize a community of 22,000 into structures that are robust and can engage with the private sector? So we actually had to beef up the team post that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Question. It also sounds like a session was part about setting expectations with
yes.
the players themselves.
Correct.
About what you would be able to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, we did some training, so we did one-on-one training. At this stage of the assessment, the relationship between the company and the community, I'll say non-existent, but it was non-existent at a corporate level, if I can call it that, because the company, we know that when we're dealing with the private sector, they're not homogenous entities, right? So you've got the CEO saying all the right things, you've got a tier of management towing that line, and then you've got the guys out in the field, the community liaison officers that are often called, saying a very different thing. So you kind of have to wrap your head around that structure and get a better understanding of, so who are your allies, who are the champions for this process. So we did a lot of that up front. We did some training, we did dispute resolution, fairly formal dispute resolution training. We don't do that anymore. We've learned that perhaps we need to even get better at that. How are we training communities to come in to engage? Are we expecting a bit too much of them? And so on. So we did a lot of that up front. The Uganda case then was also, so we build capacity so that they can make an informed choice. And yes, we have to deal with expectations. Also from the private sector. I think some of us make the assumption that it's the communities who are the ones who need capacity building. Well, it's also the private sector in a lot of instances. And they can be less receptive because I think there is a sense of, we don't have anything to learn. We know how to handle these communities. And so that's something we grapple with. Yeah.
We're talking about 22,000 people community, so I was wondering how you prioritize the interests of anyone. Have you selected representatives, focus on some issues? How do you manage that?
Great question. We were fortunate in this case that Oxfam International and Oxfam Uganda, as well as a local NGO, Uganda Land Alliance, had worked with the communities to identify representatives. So by the time we went to the field, we in essence were presented with the structure of representation. But one of the things we struggle with, as most of you who are mediation practitioners know, it's far better to have at the negotiating table the impacted individuals themselves. Yes, their lawyers are involved. For us, it's often civil society. But we need to be hearing from the impacted people. And so we're very mindful of making sure that civil society don't gatekeep that access, just as you would a lawyer, right? And so we had to work with the civil society organizations and the community to grow that structure of representation. We also are conscious of gender equity. We wanted to see more women involved. We wanted to see more minority interests being expressed, so the youth, the elderly. The community were really open to that, and so we did a very, almost a naive process of calling these massive public meetings and saying, you know, show of hands, are these your chosen representatives? And they endorsed additional ones. By the time we ended, we had in total 9 representatives for both communities. Yeah.
We're the time, and
Okay.
we've got all the stages to go through here.
Great. Okay.
And we do appreciate your questions, so you know
Yes.
we want to make this interactive.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So then we moved into, so once we've done the assessment, the community says we really want to talk to the company, and the company says we've got nothing else, you know, we've got to try talking to the community, we don't know where else to go. We were then able to move into our dispute, into the mediation phase, the dispute resolution phase, so out of assessment into dispute resolution. And so we captured that agreement to enter dispute resolution. Very, very interesting, because when we started, the company said, we want to talk to the community, but over our dead bodies will be, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you know, we will not be talking to Oxfam. They've gone global on us. They've gone to The Guardian, the New York Times. They're calling us murderers. We're not going to negotiate with civil society, but we'll talk to the community. The community said, we'll talk to the company, but there's no way we're talking to the company without civil society. You know, we're not equipped. We don't have the capacity. We don't have, you know, and so on. So that was, of course, a precondition that we had to negotiate that we did manage to overcome. But what's really interesting is when you fast forward 6-8 months later, nobody really is mindful of whether it's civil society, whether it's the community. The communities are speaking on their own behalf. Civil society have recognized, and that trust starts developing over time. So it's way less about, you know, positional, who's at the table and who isn't. It's far more about saying, you know, as long as we've got capacitated people here, and there's trust and there's consistency, those issues just became non-issues, which was quite interesting.
And did you have the feeling at this early stage in the process that the people who were speaking for this very large constituency had the ability to channel their concerns and shape their vision of what was happening?
So, David, we had to do a lot of the capacity building up front before each plenary session. So our local team of mediators would literally meet 2 or 3 days before with the community reps, before bringing them together with the company so that they could build up their capacity, help them do real reality testing, check what their bargaining position was going to be. So when they moved into the room with the company, they felt more able to do that. In the beginning, I mean, we had real concerns about the capacity of the community. They'd never done this before. They'd never sat at a boardroom table with this company, let alone any company. And it's one of the outcomes, right? It's to see the growth and the capacity being, you know. So, for example, the woman that you see, Jane, in front of you, when we started this complaint, she would not say a word at the table. She would not say a word. And through the process, as she's built her confidence, and she was carrying an enormous onus and burden on her shoulders. The community were trusting her to go into that situation and bargain for them, which is a big ask. And she just kept on stepping up and stepping up. And now when we go, she's the one who calls the public meetings. I mean, you can't get a word in. I mean, you have to say, do you mind if I just say? She's like, it's remarkable. It's wonderful to see. It's those things. I think it's the anecdotal, spiritual stuff that we see in dispute resolution that really came out so strongly in this case for us. So once we had that agreement for mediation, we then moved into setting ground rules. Who are your representatives going to be? Are they mandated? What are we going to do about the media? Are we going to be talking to the media? What are we going to do about confidentiality? You know, so it's 10,000, 20,000 people. How can you guarantee that what we as the company tell you in the room is not going to be dispersed out into the communities and so on? So we had to try and match that with transparency. We're a public accounting body. We've got civil society internationally wanting to know what's going on. We were heavily criticized by civil society once the ground rules were established, because what the parties said was, we want this to be confidential. Don't want information out there. The government does not necessarily endorse this process. They've told us these are encroachers. And so there was quite high anxiety about how to structure confidentiality. And so we were accused of, what is the CEO doing, gagging communities? So, lots of little obstacles we had to overcome along the way. So we established those ground rules, and then the parties did a very loose design around how to then move forward on the dialogue. Were they going to meet monthly? Were they always going to be in plenary? Would we use some kind of shuttle diplomacy, separate meetings, training, and that kind of thing? Yeah.
As you built this process, in your assessment, was there a Ugandan customary or indigenous dispute resolution process that you either assessed, looked at, or deviated from? You mentioned the courts, but it seems like this is a new process in here. Was there something there, especially within that community or that area?
Absolutely. Great question. I think that's where we were really guided by our Ugandan mediator who we were working with, who really, she's a magistrate, she's a mediator, she had done a lot of work with the Lord's Resistance Army, she had done a lot of work in the IDP camp, so she had dealt with displaced people before. And so she was really able to help us structure. You'll see a beautiful picture of a meeting under a tree. I mean, we did a lot of that, a lot of outdoor meetings. What we call in South Africa the Indaba, communities very naturally coming together to listen to stories. We use that a lot. In terms of the actual mediation, when we've got the representatives sitting at the table with the company, other than things like, do you start with a prayer, don't you start with a prayer, do we need moral observers, don't we need moral observers? I'm not aware of any indigenous mediation practices that require you to step far from what you would do in a court annex situation in a small claims court, to be quite frank with you. I think it's a lot of the structure around it rather than what's going to happen at the actual table. Yeah.
I'm noting, in line with what you said about story, that one of the folks here today has on her computer a wonderful sticker, and if you don't mind my reading it, this is all being recorded somewhere. The shortest distance between two people is a story. And I was thinking that's a very poignant thought and very much in line with what you're describing.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And so there's the picture. So we did a lot of the facilitation around the dialogue, around trying to get some consensus building would happen wherever we could gather community members. Very seldom did we meet in the capital. It was mainly out in either the Chibogo or the Mubende districts. And so,
can you go back one?
Do you know that you did this the last time?
There's someone that you have met who's in that picture, so that's Gina.
So we reached settlement between first the Mubende community and subsequently the Chiboga community with the company. And there's some pictures of those agreements being signed. The man in the brightly coloured shirt is the company representative who sat at the table, and he is embracing one of the community representatives, and then the signing, and then the group. Both of our mediators are there. Sorry, it's a very small picture, but in the brochure that you've got, you'll see a picture of them. And unfortunately, 2 of the community representatives passed away in the course of this, for natural causes, but passed away in the course of this. I just want to recognise them, and you'll see them mentioned in the story as well. Because without those representatives from the community who sacrificed an enormous amount of time and energy, and some of them with very young children at their sides, we would not have got as far as we did, so as well as the company.
A lovely in memoriam page in this report.
Yeah. And so, what were those agreements? They captured in a lot more detail in the publication. But in essence, the communities formed legally registered cooperative societies. Membership was open to anybody who had been evicted. Unfortunately, because this process took in one community 2 years and the other community 3 years, some of the communities that had been evicted went either back home. They weren't all Ugandan they weren't all from Uganda. Those who were from Uganda were from very rural areas. They moved back to their homesteads. They didn't stay in the vicinity of the Mubende Chibuga districts. But the membership was open to whoever claimed eviction and wanted to be a part of the cooperative structures. The company, as you know, was forbidden to pay compensation to the community. So the company agreed that they would extend their corporate social responsibility program by offering financial aid to the cooperative society. So it wasn't individual compensation. Some might call that for stipulation. They were able to use that to acquire land. So the community cooperatives now own hectares of land onto which the communities have started to resettle. Because the Chiboga community settlement took place a year later, for some technical reasons that I'm not able to share, but in a lot bigger community, a lot more disparate. By the time they reached settlement, the Ugandan government had a fundamental shift toward their approach on evictions, and they authorized the National Forestry Authority to actually help that community acquire additional land. Major transformation. So that took a little longer to achieve.
And within those co-ops, the individuals and families were able to lay claim, so to speak, or set up a household in, was it 1 acre?
No, so one community had 500 acres, the other community is going to be at about 1,500 acres by the time they finished acquiring the land.
And to what extent was that land allocated to individuals as opposed to the entire cooperative?
So the cooperative owns the land, but each individual is given a certain hectareage of land. So the co-op decides that, they call an AGM, they decide what is each community member going to get. They call it a household. So if you have a household of whatever the number is, you get X hectares. In the one community co-op, it's one hectare per household, and then you have 1 hectare to grow produce on, and they have communal farming lands. In the Chiboga community, they're still moving onto land. We've got some real obstacles around the legality of the land acquisition process, unfortunately. But I assume they're going to have the same system. That was all up to the community cooperatives to decide. We did not want to regulate that at all. They had the financial support. They then went ahead and decided how they were going to structure their process moving forward. The company also financed what we call joint development projects. So we set up joint development forums as a way of trying to keep the ongoing dialogue between the community and the company. And fortunately, we were able to bring in government. So the district officials, the company and the community meet quarterly to decide what additional development projects are required for these communities. A real challenge we faced is the conflict between these two communities who now were being resettled. They were getting financial support, and they had, their capacity was growing, so they were able to make demands of government that other communities weren't. Conflict between communities now who had never been evicted, who felt, well, hold on a sec, so now we've got to get evicted in order to create better lives for ourselves. And so we really have had to manage that as best we can. Fortunately, there hasn't been any major eruptions of conflict between communities. But it is something that we have to keep those three stakeholders talking about, and the company's been very useful in managing that.
Can you describe what happened in the moments leading up to when this picture was taken?
So this is actually one of the final community. So this is the Chiboga community, which took a lot longer than the Mubende community. This is about 6 months after the Mubende community had signed the agreement to settle. The Chiboga community was still living in very dire circumstances and dispersed. And they had started gathering. So we were coming to meet with them to give them the final offer that was being presented by the company. And, you know, we had a sense before this meeting that it was actually going to be, you know, because we had done some caucusing with the party, so we knew that the community were in all likelihood going to be accepting this. But this was really the formal process where we went with the community representatives out to the broader community to say, so this is what the company is prepared to offer. This is what government is saying they're prepared to do, and is this acceptable to you? And so this meeting was really for the community representatives to go back out to the community, their constituency, to get that final endorsement that this was something that they were prepared to accept.
The picture communicates not only joy, but to me at least, it suggests the importance of that ritual moment of people coming together to hear this together and affirm it together. Could have been done probably in some other way.
Yeah.
But this was by intention, I'm
yes.
guessing?
Yes. Yeah, no, it was. So feedback loops, the community representatives' ability to constantly go back to their communities. Chiboga had set up about over 50, I think it was, community kind of feedback loops. So these subgroups of community members who would then go on and tell other subgroups of community members to keep everybody informed about what was happening. One, so that they could get the mandate when they needed it, but two, to try and just assure people that things were moving to avoid conflict between the company and the community that were living on the boundaries. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I have a couple of questions. One is about the
Speak a little louder.
The cooperatives that you refer to seem to have been a pretty key part in terms of the way that you structured the remedy or the resolution in this conflict. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the precedent within Uganda for this type of organization to be created and managed, and in terms of whether it's sort of a novel concept or if it's very well established, if it has some sort of historical roots within Ugandan society to create these kinds of cooperatives.
Right.
And also in terms of the final settlement, perhaps you were going to get to this further on in the discussion, but what does how is finality sort of determined in terms of the settlement? What makes it final?
Great. So on the community co-op, no, not novel at all. I mean, so my understanding of the practice of the establishment of community cooperatives about 20 years ago. So there's Ugandan law that regulates this, and it's regulated at a district level. So they have district community cooperative officials who manage cooperatives. So it's deeply ingrained in how the communities gather and work together on projects. But my understanding is that just because of the conflict in Uganda, that community cooperatives are not used as much as they were. But by the time that this process unfolded, it was definitely the easiest vehicle for the communities to use to constitute themselves in a legally structured way to enable the receipt of financial assistance and enable the company to contribute. So no, this was not novel at all. And in fact, they have lots of civil society, not lots, but I mean, they have civil society organizations in Uganda that we brought in to train the communities on co-ops, on setting them up, on holding their AGMs. So it's I don't know if that answers your question.
In terms of the legal enforceability of
yes.
the final settlement, the contract enforceable under
yes, so it's a
Ugandan
civil
law.
contract between so it's enforceable under Ugandan law. Of course, you face the obstacle of going to court. But it would be like any other written agreement between a private sector client and the community or between two individuals. So it's a contract between two parties. If there's breach of that contract, you would go to court. So if that's the finality question, yes, we have a monitoring role too. So we are still involved. This case is still open. The agreements have been signed, so we're not actively resolving disputes in that context, but we are monitoring the implementation. So, you know, is the company doing what it's legally obligated to do in terms of the contract? Is the community doing what it's legally obligated to do? I mean, we don't really have very sharp teeth to do anything if they don't, to be quite frank. We would simply refer the complaint to compliance.
And was the government a signatory?
No, government was not a signatory.
The parties to the contract are the cooperative and,
yes.
And the company?
Yes.
The cooperative is the party to the contract.
Yeah, okay.
Correct.
So,
okay, so some of the outcomes was the community cooperatives were able to acquire land. This is a picture of a woman who had been evicted moving onto that land to start building her life. That is William Bakashisha. He was the chairperson of the Mubende community, welcoming her onto the land. This is examples of the houses that have then started to build. They started to build very rudimentary structures initially, and then slowly turning those into clay and brick homes. Harvesting crops, the fertility of the land is remarkable. So within a year, they were harvesting crops for subsistence living and then generating surplus that was sold to the market. So sorghum, maize, bananas, coffee. They have started beehive projects as well. So restoration of livelihoods is well underway. But there are some real key fundamental challenges that the community faces. And we're seeing that now in terms of the implementation, and it goes towards the sustainability of the outcomes. So, we often ask a couple of questions around this work. Can you say that the communities are actually better off now than they were before they were evicted? Is this a successful case? What does the CEO say that this is, kind of gold chip standard case? I mean, I don't know the answers to all those questions. I don't think it's about whether it's successful or not. I think for us it's about saying, what did the community want from the company? Were they satisfied with the outcome of this case? And that's how we would try and engage with this notion of, is dispute resolution an appropriate response to a situation where communities claim their human rights have been violated? So we really try and vest that self-determination in the hands of the community and avoid the kind of paternalistic, well, no, it's not good enough, and we're going to make that decision for them. Did the community have the capacity, the requisite capacity, to make demands of the company that they should have made? I mean, I think as far as managing the process is concerned, this was a really robust dispute resolution process with highly skilled mediators. And with skilled and capacitated parties. So I think we have to, at some level, trust the process.
Yeah. The way you framed the outcome, obviously one of the key criteria was the community and its feeling of involvement, being heard, getting their needs met. What about on the other side? How did the company feel about this outcome? Were they satisfied with the process and the outcome?
Yes, I mean, we capture a comment from the company in the brochure as well. We try to keep that as neutral as possible and really just let their voices come through. I think the company's attitude was there was very little else they could do at that stage. They had no working relationship with Oxfam. I think the global campaign really made that difficult for the company. There was enormous tension between the community and the company. And what we're told, there was also tension between the company and government because of the company's willingness and desire to try and resolve the issues with the community. So once again, is the company happy with the outcomes? I mean, they signed the agreement. They have really good project-level working relationships with the communities. They sit on a joint development forum with a community structure that they weren't previously engaging with on as regular a basis as they are now. I mean, I think that the best people to ask in that regard is the company. The company claimed that they were doing this anyway, that they've got ongoing community projects with other communities. This is not something unique to them. They were doing lots of development projects with other communities. And that, that might still be their view.
And did they view you and the team of mediators they created, did both sides view you as truly impartial, or as having how did they view you?
I walked away from that case telling myself, as long as both parties see you as being partial, you're okay, because then at least you know that you're multi-partial, you're dealing with them both.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So no, and I still don't believe that's the case. And I mean, I don't, I think the company, I don't think the company's ungrateful. I think the company felt, I think that the company's got real issues around the fact that through an international financial intermediary that you're not even getting direct financing from, you have to say, open the door to the CAO. Having said that, they were really open to us coming because, as I say, at that stage, there was really many other opportunities for them to engage, and they did want to find a solution and a way forward. And the community, it's not just the community, 22,000, I don't know if it was, we never did a baseline. Some will say, but did you ever verify that Oxfam were not inflating the numbers? Did you ever do that? And we said, well, no, we moved beyond a rights-based approach, because if we had gone there, then we might as well have just gone to court. We said to the company, this community want to engage. We can't prove to you that they're 22,000 or otherwise. And fortunately, the company said, you know what, that's actually not what we're interested in. We recognize there's a problem. We want to do something about it.
I see some hands, but could I just ask the flip side of the question? You said that the company saw you as partial to the community.
Yes.
Did the community likewise feel that you were on the side of the company?
I think that that ebbed and flowed a little bit. I think it's at points, I would say at the end of the process, there was sufficient, and there currently is, I think we have credibility on both sides. I think that we are trusted as independent. Civil society and the community are not one and the same thing. And you will note from the Oxfam comment in the publication, Oxfam firmly believes that the CAO should have done a compliance review of the IFC. We've done nothing to address IFC's due diligence. Should they have ever enabled the NFC to benefit financially, given the context of evictions and land ownership and so on in Uganda? We never addressed that question. And the community were comfortable with that. Mm-hmm. They wanted dialogue with the company. They wanted land.
They wanted to look forward instead of back. Calder.
What do you think would have happened if you hadn't got involved? Would both parties have gone to litigation locally in Uganda, or was there litigation pending? I think you mentioned an English company in South Africa financing. Was there all sorts of litigation flying around? So the community did go to court. I think, possibly the community might have tried to pursue legal action against the company. I'm not sure. I think that the tensions between international civil society and the company and the government could have really worsened. There was no valve, there was no ability to come together, and some of the community members were actually threatened with death and had to pull out. So I think things were getting really, really worse, if that's even possible. And I think the entry point, and it might not have been the CEO, but just the ability to come in and provide an alternative and a safer entry point and start those conversations enabled that valve, that release where people could start coming together and saying, okay, let's work toward a different future.
Yes.
Do you evaluate which mediation model you use? If this CEO has a standard mediation model in terms of how facilitative, how directive you want to be, or do you go along with mediators you choose, the case you choose? How do you go about it?
So we very we don't like to be prescriptive about the model. We've got a team, so my background's mediation, a couple of my specialists are mediators. We've got a lot better and we've got a lot more budget toward growing our network of mediators. So we've moved away from the Golden Rolodex. We hold regional workshops trying to identify mediators. In April, we're bringing all of our mediators, so we've held 7 of those across the globe. In April, we're bringing all of our global mediators together for a summit in DC. Not to tell them what to do, but to try and develop some consistency of practice, if you like, around fundamental challenges and key principles of practice. Things like confidentiality, impartiality, transparency, representation. The big things in this company community conflict resolution that we see recurring. Can we try and get some principles going, a set of questions and a toolbox approach? Because we see all types of models of mediation being used. And that's why we use local mediators. So it's an Afrikaans term. I'm not Afrikaans, but it's an Afrikaans term that works. It's local is lekker. Local is nice. We believe that you have to go as local as possible. We don't want to fly in from DC and tell anybody to do anything. So that's why we will immediately, in the assessment, we appoint local mediators. We will go as local as we can.
very difficult to do.
Apropos the point about your background, how did the cultural issues or the cultural dynamics of this process play out from your standpoint?
So, I mean, once again, the buffer zone for us is working with local mediators.
Yeah.
So, Lena Zadriga is a phenomenal, formidable force. She was really able to, we just defer to whoever is from as close to the community as possible, and start building the relationships and building the trust. I think in situations such as these, where the conflict is so tense and the alternatives are so few, people are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt more than I think we perhaps always deserve. And so I never encountered, and I haven't yet, it being at the CAO, a situation of any hostility because I'm not from the region, or but I think it's about you. It's what you bring in, right? It's often what the external person is bringing into the situation that creates those barriers. It's not barriers that are predetermined before you get there culturally.
And I just want to say something about the quality of relationship that develops in a process like this, and maybe not for everybody and in every case, but in your case, in this case study, when I asked Gina about somebody who was in one of the pictures, and then all of a sudden you just told me like her life story, having those kinds of personal connections, relationships, I imagine goes a long way, whether it's sharing stories or sharing experiences or both, toward bridging differences. I saw so many other hands, so we'll swing around the room as best we can from left to right, and please.
Just very quickly, I find a lot of this very disturbing. I find a lot of it very hopeful. So it's great that there were better outcomes for this, and this is wonderful. You said you were having a mediators conference next month, which seemed wonderful. But are there other broader lessons that IFIs can draw? I work on the Indus very specifically, so I know a lot about what happens specifically with dam development and the development of canal colonies. Very, very disturbing because people often get very marginal land.
Yes.
So, the reason they were on that land to begin with is because it's more productive. And then if they're sent somewhere else, it's because it's really less productive.
Yeah.
People know where to settle. So, are IFIs, are there broader lessons that you disseminate to IFIs in general? And, you mentioned one hopeful where the Ugandan government seemed to have become, enlightened and said, give them some land and then let's tackle this from the beginning. That sounds great. But really, what are the other broader lessons beyond, a couple of communities?
Yeah. And I welcome your cynicism. I share it. Yeah. My background is human rights. It's very difficult and troubling when you enter, and to be accused of almost enabling the private sector to continue the abuses, because. And also, being accused by some academics of really we go in and sweep up after the IFI's mess. I get all of that because I think those are real concerns that we have to be super mindful of. So what are we doing about that? In this Uganda example, what are the alternatives? What do you do? And I'm just kind of throwing this back because what do you do in a situation where government says your encroachers get out, community sues government, and that's a 10-year backlog. Company says, hey, we're not culpable, we're not responsible. We've been given clear, unencumbered land. Those are encroachers and we didn't evict them. So they carry on the operations. To stand back and say, well, we're not going to do anything because dispute resolution is only going to make things seem nice and tidy and the culpable parties are going to get off scot-free, I don't think is an alternative either. So these are really difficult, complex situations. What we're trying to do to broaden the impact, if you like, is through the advisory arm of the CAO and also under dispute resolution is going back to the institution and saying, okay, so on this case, what are the lessons? What can you not do in future? And in fact, in this case, the IFC stopped its tranche to the fund when we received this complaint to say, well, hold on a sec, something's going on here. Is this good enough? I'm not sure. I don't think it means they're not going to go and invest in any other agribusiness projects in which we've got this lacuna, this what we call an accountability gap, where you've got government sanctioning the private sector entry point and not doing anything to regulate it. That's a problem, right? So we are trying to share lessons back to the institution. And then the advisory arm is also pulling lessons from the DR work and the compliance work. We work very closely with civil society, who have come up with a report around the effectiveness of these mechanisms and trying to change the institution. And we're working quite a lot with civil society to help them understand what we're trying to do in dispute resolution. And we're not saying mediation is the panacea for all ills. It's not.
It kind of follows up, I think. I was with Bangladeshi government officials last week, and what they were concerned about with a model like this was it doesn't address the power differentials between the parties. And that, sounds great, but a couple different examples. The other guy's more powerful, the government official's been bought off with a bribe. Did you see that here, and did you, how did you try to deal with it?
Well, because government wasn't a counterpart, we didn't have we do in other cases, this issue of authority, of government, of power. When we started, it's a challenge we all face as mediators, the power dynamic, the unlevel playing field. Can you ever align that 100%? I don't think you can. I think you can, you can bring resources to bear on building that capacity as best you can. Do I feel like in this case we got it good enough for the communities to make that informed choice? I believe we did. I think communities are best placed to know what's best for them and to make those decisions. But they need support, they need guidance, they need robust mediators and mediation systems to help them. And in some situations you can't get that right because of reprisals, intimidation and victimization. I don't think it's appropriate then to say this model can never work where you've got an imbalance in power. But I think in some situations leveling that power imbalance is harder than others.
Yes.
And extending on that same theme, the partnership with private sector and communities is seen as a valuable thing in many places. One of the questions is, why would the private sector continue to engage? So have you done an after-action debrief with the company, and what's their measure of success of this?
So, the case is still open, so we're still monitoring the case, and we're still in constant discussions and kind of ongoing mediation, if you like, around implementations, because on the one community we've got legal issues that we're really grappling with on the land ownership and what's happened in the course of acquiring the land for the community. I think that the company sees this as, well, I don't really want to speak on behalf of the company. They've got a quote and it's there. Do they deem this successful? What I can say is factual. The company meets on a regular basis with the community. The company has gone above and beyond the terms of the agreement in providing an outgrowth program for the community, in building schools and so on for communities in and around the area of concern. So I think there is a working relationship between the company and the community. I'm not saying there wasn't ever one. I think the company might argue that there was anyway. What I can say is that it's routine. The community has full capacity to engage. We've actually employed a community development coordinator to facilitate the engagements around these joint development forums to make sure that that capacity is built.
We have time for one more question, and then after we adjourn promptly at 1 o'clock, are you able to stick around for a few minutes?
Absolutely.
So we'll be happy to talk with folks. This is the second time now that we've had this conversation, and I'm bursting with questions about things like what does it feel like to be part of an organization that has both enforcement and dispute resolution capacities within it? And of course, we're all aware of institutions in this country and elsewhere that have that unique feature. And how do you manage that?
Yeah.
I also know that many people here wonder whether having a law degree makes any difference, or maybe it's an impediment to being able to do this work, or maybe it's an advantage, and you might be able to speak to that. We have...
I was just going to say, we have the room for as long as you want, so if you want to continue the conversation and you can stay, those who can stay can stay.
Terrific. So why don't we do this? Why don't we take one more question, and then we'll give people a chance, if they need to leave at 1 o'clock, to do that. And then we'll stick around and talk a little bit more.
Great.
Okay? Fabulous. I saw other hands. Yes?
Did you find that within the community there were any fractures between different subsets that created a problem for you? I mean, it sounds as if they sort of all got together and were able to collaboratively be on one side. Were they one side, or were they 30 seconds.
No, I mean, I think that it was, I can't say with 100% certainty that of the evicted community members, every one of them is happy with this outcome. I cannot say that. I can say that the representatives we were working with, we did what we felt was reasonable to ensure that they had a legitimate mandate to represent their communities. But we all know representation is dynamic, right? It changes from one month to the next. So at the time of signing the agreements, we believed that the community representatives that had it, they had done what they needed to do legally, held an AGM, got the members of their cooperatives to agree that this was something that they wanted to endorse. So we had done what I feel we had to do in terms of due diligence to establish that. But in terms of really managing all those expectations, no, I can't say that with certainty. I do know that there was no signs of conflict. I think one-on-one, yes, certainly there are going to be community members who felt perhaps it took too long or they didn't get enough land, and we did devolve that power straight to the community when that agreement was reached, and even when the co-ops were structured, it was up to the community to decide how are they going to divvy up the land. We really left that up to them, bringing in trainers, bringing in supporters to help them think it through. I mean, that's an enormous challenge, right? We're dealing with a complaint in Chad, on the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. That's 25,000 community members along the Chad pipeline with 9 different civil society organizations in a negotiation with ExxonMobil. Because of the terrorist attacks, there's a travel, the World Bank gets really kind of worked up with anything that goes on, and they stop you from traveling when anything happens. So we can't actually get out to the field to be working with our local mediators. I mean, is it ever going to be good enough, that process, for the CAO to be able to say, you know, that's a 100% endorsed process? I'm not sure. I think it's in some situations the best we can hope for is to go to the community, to work with the elected representatives and say, you have to tell us what you want from this process, and we can try and deliver that. And if you're not happy with it, then don't do it. Don't be a part of it. Go look at alternatives. Maybe go to court. Maybe go to international tribunals, whatever it might be.
So I want to respect people's time frames, and so I'd like to just comment that one of the goals in having you come here today, Gina, was to give more visibility and more recognition for CAO in communities where it may not be where your work may not be well known, and also for us to learn from your experience. As you can see, Gina is a remarkable practitioner, and so please join me in thanking her for coming.